type of relationship, and then with social media. But then there's another side where you don't really need social media. The outside world is there.
I think that social media can be a great thing if you're just using it to keep in contact with your friends, but obviously there are some things that can go wrong. As with anything in life, there are pros and cons to it.
A way to stay balanced with social media is not by cutting it off completely. By starting small, taking breaks, and limiting yourself is an effective way to decrease our risks of being exposed to toxic things that come from social media comparisons.
I feel like if there are outlets promoting things like the YMCA, the Boys and Girls Club, or even after-school activities, even block parties, to be honest, just stuff that can get people outside their houses and having fun.
Go do something where you can get the sunlight you need, where you don't have to be on social media to have that fun, where you can get active but still be able to access social media. You don't always have to be using it, but you also don't always have to be off of it.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are we feeling today? So if you know me, you know I'm about community. That did not sound like community. Good afternoon, everyone. How are we feeling today? Yes. So today we're going to talk to you all about finding balance and safety on social media, and is it possible? Today, over at the keynote panel, we talked about some very basic aspects, and here we're going to dive right into it. So we're going to do some brief introductions, and to my left, I have Dr. Gould, and Dr. Gould is an endowed professor of epidemiology and psychiatry at Columbia University, Irving Medical Center, and research scientist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Dr. Gould's research has laid the groundwork for many state, national, and international suicide prevention programs. Next, we have Dr. DeChowdhury, and she is an American professor. I'm sorry, it's not American, it's associate professor. So she is an associate professor of interactive computing at Georgia Tech. Dr. DeChowdhury is best known for laying the foundation of a new line of research that develops computational techniques towards understanding and improving mental health outcomes through ethical analysis of social media data. Then we have Lieutenant Felix Rivera, who has served the city of New York and the NYPD for over 25 years, and he has led a precinct detective squad where he supervised thousands of criminal investigations in the most populated areas of New York City, which include the Theater District, the Diamond District, as well as Rockefeller Center and Times Square. He currently commands the NYPD Computer Crime Squad and is the commander of the New York City Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, also known as ICAC. So if I do say ICAC, that's what we're making reference to. And his role in the Computer Crime Squad has honored him to provide investigative assistance to some of the most sensitive investigations, which unfortunately some have resulted in death. Next, we have Dr. Radesky, who we met earlier, and Dr. Radesky is the David G. Dickinson Collegiate Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Michigan Medical School. She is director of the Division of Developmental Behavioral Pediatrics and focuses clinically on autism, neurodiversity, and advocacy. She authored the American Academy of Pediatrics Policy Statements, Media and Young Minds in Digital Advertising to Children, and is a co-medical director of the SAMHSA-funded AAP Center of Excellence on Social Media and Youth Mental Health. And then we have senior investigator Justin Stevens. He too is a part of ICAC, and he has been a part of New York State Police since June 2013, and during his tenure in ICAC task force, Senior Investigator Stevens has reviewed thousands of cyber tips received from the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, which involved investigations locating predators engaged in sexual exploitation of children and resulted in identifying, educating, and rescuing child victims. And I'm Tiara Springer Love, pronouns she, her. I am the Director of Youth Power at Families Together in New York State, where our philosophy is nothing about us without us. You cannot have conversations about young people without us being present and at the table. We believe in peer support. We believe in supporting adults who want to learn more about helping children and helping peers. Another big part of the work that we do is that we all are peers. So for me, in my lived experience, I am a young adult who lives with mental illness, and I've also navigated not only the mental health system, but also the child welfare system as an adoptee. So please give it up for all of our wonderful panelists. So Dr. Gould, you've spent a lot of your career looking at suicide prevention, and in 2003, you published research that talked about vulnerable populations, such as children, and I want to know from you, we are in 2023, 20 years later, I want you to first share with the audience what that research talked about, and if you have seen any differences 20 years later from your research, as well as how has social media impacted the conversation around suicide prevention.
Is this, yep, it is on. Thank you for having me here, in that I think we learned so much earlier, and hopefully continue to learn so much. I'm going to first focus specifically on the research that I've conducted for decades on suicide contagion. Because when I had started that work, people in the media particularly, but even many advocates, didn't appreciate how and the fine tunings of messaging that are needed when you talk about your own suicidal problems, or that you're trying to engage the media in more general stories, that suicide contagion is real. That literally it's decades and myriads of research that has shown that. And so in 2003, there were calls to action with regard to how the media should present stories, but even how advocates should focus on hope and recovery when they're focusing on their own stories. So with regard to now, in 2023, those concerns are greater than ever, because social media, as we all know, the communications are faster, more far-reaching, and somewhat out of control. We know, and what I'm going to do, so that everybody doesn't get too depressed, I'll start with concerns and then move on to the very positive things that we could be doing with suicide prevention. So I'll just emphasize again that, as we know, young people are exposed to graphic displays of suicidal expression and acts on social media, and they have sometimes dire consequences. We also know that young people are exposed to cyberbullying, which is associated with suicidal behavior, and for all the reasons that people have mentioned earlier about increases in anxiety and depression, associated with suicidal behavior. But I want to really emphasize today, in the couple of minutes that I have, is how social media can be used for suicide prevention, and that we should be very hopeful and have very positive programs that focus on, and I'll start with one in particular. There are now recommendations that have been developed with young people, the input from young people, as well as health professionals, mental health professionals, that guide safe communications about suicidal, thoughts online. And there's one in particular that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention, because you probably are not familiar with it, and you can Google it, #ChatSafe. And these are recommendations on this in particular is focused to young people, and I wanted to bring that up given your background and the audience's experiences now with all these listening tours that you've done. So that young people are both exposed to other people's suicidal ideation as well as their own. With regard to their own, there are recommendations to first stop, think, why am I even sharing this information? What impact will it have on other people? Is it a call for help? Is it, as people have mentioned earlier today, is it a way to produce more likes? And that to really take what you're doing very, very seriously. And then there are many other recommendations that I won't go through all of them, but we know what makes messaging safe now and what makes it harmful. And again, stories about hope and recovery rather than death and despair are things that young people and adults should focus on in these stories. But with regard to young people, and we know that young people talk to other young people, they reach out for help from young people, and young people, all of us, but we can feel responsible. And before people react to someone's suicidal thoughts that are posted, you really have to think very seriously, do I feel comfortable? Do I feel confident in being able to know how to deal with this situation? And it's okay if you don't, because you can reach out to other people who can help you. And that we've really emphasized with young people to reach out to a trusted adult or another friend, someone in the social network of someone who may be calling out for help, to check on them, the person's parents. And I do want to have a call out to 988 because we've spent decades evaluating it. It's very effective. Not only can you call or text 988 for your own despair, but if you're worried about someone else, so that if a young person reads a post, their friend is suicidal, and they really don't know how to handle the situation, they can text 988, who will help guide them so that they can be very effective with getting that young person help. So in just a few minutes, I do want to emphasize what people have emphasized earlier. The social media is not all good, it's not all bad in general, and it's the same thing for suicide. It unfortunately can increase risk, but even more importantly, it can be used to save people's lives. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. I know when I was just younger, right, not too long ago, but when I was younger, it was a big thing with young people completing acts of suicide online, right, and showing it on Facebook. And now that you're talking about, now we have responses online. So in order for us to know who's in the building, I know that there's a QR code on the table, many of you scanned, and there are a few questions that were asked. So if we can go over the responses to the poll, if we can pull up those results. So it seems as though most of us here are advocates. I love that. Beautiful. And then we have another, the next portion is, highest portion is school-based mental health. So it seems as though many of us are already in the field of advocacy and working within mental health. And the next question was, do you think it is possible for kids to be safe when using social media? And I love the fact that many of you are saying yes, because that means that there is hope. Many people have said no as well, and then others are just unsure, which is probably why you're here. So I hope you have your pens out and you're taking notes on how you are going to answer these calls to actions, because we are here to help save our young people and to save lives. Do you think it is possible for kids to find balance when using social media? So we also say yes to that. So many of us think that we can be safe and that we all can find balance. So thank you. So next we're going to direct the next question to Dr. I'm sorry. Dr. DeChowdhury, and we've practiced this all day, guys, so for this very moment, and I'm so nervous I messed it up. So Dr. DeChowdhury, you've done extensive research as well at the intersection of social media and health, and you've spoken a lot about specific interest in studying disadvantaged youth and marginalized populations and how that has impacted us, especially for me as a young person of color. So if you can also share with us a brief explanation of the core to your research, and what are some of the most compelling trends that you're finding?
Thank you, Chair, for the great question, and it's my pleasure to be here. I started studying social media as a part of my doctoral research more than 15 years ago now, before the term social media existed. Those were the good old days. Social media, as a computer scientist, showed us a way forward that we could use to understand people and our lived experiences better. About 10 years ago, I pivoted to looking at mental health. As a computer scientist, I was very interested to not just look at how much time people are spending on these platforms, but to actually see what is it that they're saying and doing on these platforms. And how can we bring a technology perspective to understanding those digital trace data that can help us better understand mental health. But soon it became clear to me that social media is not a monolith. It actually influences our mental health and well-being in different ways. And like Dr. Gould was mentioning earlier, I'm going to highlight some examples of the positives and the negatives that we have seen emerge by looking at this source of data. In some of the work that we did several years ago, we found that on Instagram, speaking of negative impacts, young girls were coming to these platforms. They had an eating disorder and self-harm challenge in their lives. It was a very interesting way that they responded to some of the intervention and moderation strategies that Instagram had implemented back then. And we found that these young girls were forming these otherwise clandestine communities of pro-eating disorder behaviors where they're promoting disordered eating and unsafe, excessive exercise and eating habits. And we found that the moderation of banning certain hashtags that Instagram had implemented back then was actually not just not helpful in helping these young girls, but actually had counterproductive effects. It moved these communities to the fringes of the platform where these kinds of conversations persisted and in fact thrived. So clearly these platforms, despite their best interests, were not helping this marginalized group of young girls. But on the positive side, we also saw that for young people struggling with mental health challenges, what a huge bliss that social media can be. And this goes to youth and young people of color. This goes to youth who are sexually or gender identity-wise marginalized, LGBTQ plus youth. And we found that social media could be that safe space, could be that safe haven where they could go, not just to find other peers, other like-minded people, but we also found how these platforms were acting as auxiliary sources of social support, whether emotional or informational, to this group of young people who, for a lot of who, this was the first time and the only place that they had either disclosed about their minoritized identity or about struggling with a mental health challenge. So as the picture, as it stands and has been mentioned earlier this morning as well, we are looking at a very complex picture of social media both helping and hurting young people's mental health. And the question for my research is oftentimes, how do we better understand and bring scientific evidence to knowing what these positives and negatives are, and then thinking about what kind of technology-oriented solutions can we bring to the table so that the good is amplified and the bad is mitigated. Thank you.
Thank you. I often think about the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child, right? So we have parents, we have family, we have school. Now social media is a part of that village, and we have to figure out how can we integrate that into the village. In the plenary keynote, panel, someone spoke about intergenerational connectedness and us being open from different generations to learn what these young people are experiencing on social media. And I'm gonna direct the next question to the two officers on the panel. And as we talk about safety and we talk about privacy, and we also wanna talk about respecting young people and allowing them to maintain their dignity, right? So if something does happen, are we just turning off the Wi-Fi and saying you can't talk to this community that you've now developed online and you have to stay locked in your room? So I wanna know from you two, how do we find that balance? How do we find the balance of respecting young people's privacy and also protecting their safety? And then also, if you can add to this, like in the mix of this question, can you also share with us what are some of the biggest issues in the space right now as we know it?
It's a complicated question for sure. And it's something that we've all dealt with at some point in our lives, I'm sure, as many of you are educators and outreach specialists, physicians, and just parents or have family and friends. But it's something that we've done our entire lives. Supervision's important. We did it as a child. We were supervised by our parents. We were supervised by our teachers. We're supervised at work. Everybody has some sort of supervision in our lives, and it is critical for safety online to have some kind of supervision. And there's no one silver bullet, there's no one right answer, because every kid's a little bit different. And how you treat one may be different from how you treat the other. And that goes with developing that relationship. And some children, become more responsible at an earlier age than others. And it's important to identify that. And that's communication, because that's key in keeping our children safe online. And we need to know as parents, as teachers, as caregivers, what these children are doing online. And part of that, particularly the parental part of that, is knowing what platforms your children are on. Having access to those platforms. And that doesn't mean reading every single message that goes back and forth. It means having conversations with those children and spot checking it, because it's important. And it doesn't mean embarrassing them. It doesn't mean turning off the light switch on that internet account. It means discussing it and talking about what the pitfalls are, what the potential liabilities or problems or issues that they may come across online. I don't want to read my own emails. I certainly don't want to read my child, or every message that goes back and forth. But it's important to know who are your friends, right? And the IRL, in real life. Who are your friends in real life, and who are your friends online? And how did you get introduced to them? And having those discussions about them, just like, how was your day at school? What did you learn today? How was your day at summer camp today? What did you do? What friends did you have lunch with today? You have to have those same conversations on that digital platform as well. And as far as, what are the trends that we're seeing, and they talked a little bit about this at the plenary, is how the victims, the online victims, seem to be young women. And Dr. DeChowdhury, she mentioned, I think you specifically said young women and eating disorders. That's changing. That landscape's changing now. And now we're seeing trends in the victims being, teenage boys, even young adult boys, and they're not sexually motivated crimes, they're financially motivated. And what they're doing is they're preying on these, young adolescents who may have low self-esteem and that proverbial catfish. And the reason that they're doing this is financial. It's not sexually motivated. We want to get a compromising image. We want to get something that we can use against you so that you will pay us money. And the issue is that once you pay that money, it continues and it becomes a situation that can be difficult to get out of. The important message here is we all make mistakes. Everybody in this room makes mistakes. I've made tons of mistakes. There is always a solution. And that's a critical point to take away from today's event, is you can say all day, you know, don't take these compromising photos, don't post them online, we'll never be able to get back. That's the wrong message. There's always an answer. There's always something that can be done to mitigate the situation. Because if you leave these children or these young adults without a way out, that's when we have issues that we can't come back from. That's when we have issues like Dr. Gould discussed with suicide. There always has to be a way out. You always have to leave that door slightly ajar. You never want to put somebody in a corner where, listen, this is it, this is the way, and that's it. There's nothing we can do about it. If we don't have those discussions with our children and young adults now, they won't be prepared for life, because this social media, it's not a fad. It's here to stay, and it grows every day.
Great answer to that question. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Yeah, it's accurate. It's availability, right, and vulnerable. Our youth are both of those. I have to look on a daily basis of the sextortion side, the images and videos that our children are creating. And I stop and think for a moment while a child is taking a nude photo of themselves, sharing it with someone. I mean, they lose that sense of privacy when they share it, and they don't realize that. I only have a few moments, and I just want to feed out information. Lieutenant Rivera spoke about sextortion. It's sexually motivated, and it's also financially motivated. If you are in that situation, and share this with your kids, if you're in that situation, you need to talk to them about that happening, because there's on Spectrum News right now. There's a kid that should be walking across the stage, who should be graduating. 2 years ago, in an hour and a half, they somehow were basically coerced into producing an image, and then it was used against them, and they ultimately committed suicide. It's sad story after sad story. So if I could just share with you one bit of information is, as I'm watching a video and I'm sitting there thinking about, don't do it. Don't take your pants off, okay? So pants, if you could just use that as an analogy. Pants meaning P-A-N-T-S. So it's your private areas are private. Keep them to yourself. Don't create a digital image, right? Accountability. It's on all of us to be accountable as parents, as educators, as doctors. Accountability in education. We need to continue to educate. No, N. The N is no means no. Stick to it and instill that into your kids. When you say no, people on the internet are going to try to get you to do some imaginable things, because it's fantasy to them, and then it gets turned on them. The T, time. Take a moment. Take a moment to just slow down and think about what you're about to do. And the S, and Lieutenant Rivera actually mentioned this, is essentially say something. There's always a way out. Stop, think, say something.
Thank you. I want to highlight accountability. As we went across the state and talked to young people from Plattsburgh to Buffalo to Long Island, just about their experience as young people with mental health, they talked about accountability and how accountability was important. They also talked about the need of support for their parents. Little do you know, young people want their parents to have the help that they need in order for them to help them as children. They talked about wanting to amplify confidentiality, but yet I still want to tell my mom this thing, but I also don't know how to tell her without her freaking out, right? So it's like we're walking this thin line, and young people want to be heard. Young people want us to respect them and value their voices. And Dr. Radesky, on the other panel, you talked about accountability of parents, being mindful of the amount of social media that you are taking in as a parent. So when we talk about accountability, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable, myself included, and we have a hard time kind of stepping into that. And when we veer away from it, negative things happen, and young people are being impacted. So for children who have had these negative experiences with social media, I want you to tell us, what can adults do when it comes to supporting their young people, first off, processing it, right? Like you talked earlier about social media and in real life experiences also being two very different worlds. So how can you help a young person process a negative experience? Also, what might be the best way for parents, guardians, mentors, adult allies to be encouraging to young people to have more of an open dialogue in finding that balance?
So to establish the open communication about emotions, about sexuality, about friendships, about social media, there's two approaches. One is preventative, where throughout childhood you're kind of talking about emotions. You're allowed to be vulnerable. You're allowed to talk about your mental state and how you're coping, to a degree. Don't overload your kids with it, but making it that your language in your home is that emotions, as Mr. Rogers said, are mentionable and manageable, so that your kid will come to you and doesn't feel the same shame of like, I did something wrong, I'm bad. Because kids do, especially in that middle childhood time, they're very concrete and they start to really blame themselves when something goes wrong. When it comes to that middle childhood adolescent, you can also take the preventative approach of being like, we're going to talk about advertisements, digital media, influencers, because they have opinions and they want to be critical thinkers. They don't want to be manipulated. They want to be savvy about all of this stuff. So you kind of on the ground level, come in with like, all right, I'm going to teach you some stuff, because the internet is this big, big place. Not everyone's watching every corner of it. So people try some stuff. People post a lot of garbage. There's a lot of great stuff out there too, but I'm going to just teach you to have the smarts to avoid the garbage and know that you can come to me whatever you see, even if you think it is the most terrible or shameful thing. So that's the preventative approach. What if you're already at a point where you're like, my kid will not talk to me about this because it's just, they shut down or they think I'm going to overreact? So a couple starters that you might try is, one, talk about your own media use, because we're in this too. We're all experiencing how it feels to be bombarded by content or news or notifications. We all are trying to create our own balance. Email. Like, I can talk to my kids forever about how email affects me emotionally. So, if you can talk about, this is my emotional relationship or my distracted relationship with technology, you're helping to role model that this is something we talk and think about. You don't just do it on autopilot. And you're also helping, you're opening the door to your child joining in on that conversation. So you could talk about or ask your kids questions, like, what rules do you think I should set around my phone? What do you think my kids would be like? That laptop goes away on weekends, and we would talk about the different challenges that people are under and the drivers of their media use. Another thing for opening the door to conversations is, don't talk about you, don't talk about the kid in front of you, talk about other people. Talk about influencers, because they're doing a lot of stuff to get attention, and some of it is tacky, some of it is hilarious. So you can talk about, why did they post that? Why are they trending in that direction? Are they just trying to get more likes and hits and engagement? Tell me about what you see in your feed sometimes that just, you're like, what is this person thinking? So that you get them to be a little bit critical of the sort of content and messages that people are posting. Or to be critical or complimentary of their friends. Which of your friends do this really well? Who has the good balance and the good control around technology use, and which of them are just sucked in and the tech is controlling them? So if you can make it about displacing the conversation onto someone else, like an influencer or the Surgeon General, be like, hey, the Surgeon General just told us that this is something we should worry about. What do you think of that? Should he have said that? These are all conversation starters that hopefully you then take a deep breath and you say, I'm not going to jump in. I'm just going to sit with my child, and I'm going to listen to them, and I'm not going to judge what they're saying. And you have to set that kind of routine as something you talk about in the car, you talk about at dinner, or you talk about at some of your downtime during routines. I know that phones take up a lot of that downtime, so that's the initial part of setting some of those boundaries, so you have a little bit more time to talk. When it comes to when kids have seen something bad, so if it's bullying, if it is something that's really toxic, it's hate speech, it's witnessing someone else be harassed. There's a whole lot of, and I looked on to prep for this, the UNICEF cyberbullying website has a whole list of suggestions of what you can do. And then a lot of the platforms like Snapchat, like TikTok, Instagram, all have their own explainers of here's what you do on our platform. If you want to block someone, if you want them not to see your posts anymore, if you want to delete a post. So there's the technical things you can do to block, report, and just stop the bullying. Tell your kids, if it is a bullying interaction, don't respond, don't feed into it, don't keep checking your phone, wondering and feeding into the drama. Getting some distance from it is really important. If you are worried that there's this ongoing pattern of bullying, you may want to take some screenshots and have some evidence of what's going on. You may want to change the privacy settings or have your child talk to you about what breaks they want to take from different social media sites. If it's happening at school, you want to talk to the school about how it's happening. And this is all to just not reinforce the bullying. Cyberbullying happens because of power. And so if someone sees that they got a reaction and they were able to manipulate someone else, it's just going to keep happening and happening. So the most important part is being their partner and saying it feels very shameful to be bullied or mocked. And so being someone's partner and not just reacting and saying, that kid's the worst, we're going to do this. Just kind of say like, all right, what do you want to do? How are we going to handle this? And that shows that you are that kind of what we call in clinical work a holding environment for your child. That you're like, I can hold this for you. I can be here to help you through it. And kids are going to process the stress of what they went through so much better if you're helping them hold and organize what they're going through. If you're just reacting, they're just going to react too. And you don't recover from trauma or stressful. You don't build resilience if you're just reacting and reinforcing.
Thank you.
Tiara, just going to take 30 seconds just to add to it, and I haven't heard this mentioned yet, is I have three teenagers. All right, so I'm kind of in this space, not only in my professional work, but in my family life. I have Snapchat. I had no interest in Snapchat prior to having 3 teenagers. But I now have Snapchat. I'm in there. I am friends with my own kids. And I've learned that social media app, how to use it. And I know in this specific social media app, there is for my eyes only. So it's kind of like, I don't know if you're familiar with the old calculator apps. If your child has multiple calculator apps on their phone, you need to be investigating that, looking into that, because there's probably a secret code that opens up a hidden photo vault. And that's where a sextortionist or someone with really bad intentions is telling your kid to store their nude photos. So it's about learning about these apps, being engaged, use them yourself so you know exactly what they're doing. So I just wanted to add to that.
May I add just one thing too? Because we've been talking about adolescents, teenagers, and I know people then have been talking about maybe 10 to 14-year-olds as well. But I really want to emphasize now, because it was just striking to me when I saw the statistics, and this is with suicide. Because I've been at this for decades. And 5 to 9-year-olds, you'd hear, and it's very, very rare, so I don't want to frighten people, but for the first time, the 2020 was the most recent data that we had with regard to age-specific suicide rates. For the first time, suicide made it to the top 10 causes of death for 5 to 9-year-olds. And even after decades of working in this area, I was shocked that the problem just keeps moving younger and younger and younger. And I think it was Dr. Dusky, or other folks too, in terms of when do you allow kids to have access to, these, platforms or phones. But there are also games. And I'm going to have now, as I said, I had a shout out for various different things. I don't know how many people are grandparents in this room. Well, yeah, I think I see at least one. And I will play Roblox with, my grandchildren because they live in other states and I want to be, participating in what they're participating in. And in the same way that you were just mentioning, knowing about the social media platforms, some of these games are really horrifying. They seem benign at a certain level, but these beauty contests where they're wearing outrageous things, but then they have to vote on each other. I mean, it's instilling some very problematic values. But also these games where you're constantly dying and then coming back. You fall into lava and you die and don't get into the lava, and I've fallen into lava so many times, But just again, on a personal note, and I won't go into detail, but then you hear young kids who don't have the conception of life and death talking or singing or making up songs in this case, where I started to say, hey, where did my granddaughter learn about reincarnation, And then started thinking about the content of some of these games, and you wonder what the long-term effects, or even short-term effects, but the fact that you could see suicide creeping down into the younger ages, we really need to now wake up. I mean, we are waking up, and we're here today, but, for a lot of grandparents are the caregivers, or the, babysitters, and, I think we need to start addressing some education to some older folks as well, so that they're becoming aware of these games, rather than saying, no, I don't play that. Like, go, okay, I'll play that, even if I, don't want to, but I think we need to. So I just wanted to make sure that we talk about those really young kids as well, too.
Get involved.
Get involved, exactly.
Thank you. In the spirit of us waking up and talking about systemic change and talking about policy change, changing our own thoughts, changing our own behaviors behind youth mental health and social media, I want to close this panel out with two minutes, right? Each response on, as leaders in this space, I'd like each of you to share one or two concrete recommendations for next steps on a policy level, because we've already spoken about what we can do as individuals to hold ourselves and others accountable, but what can policy do? And we can start down here and then bring it back around.
I was thinking about how I would answer that. I was hoping I'd have more time, but policy. So let me pose this question real quick. How many seconds are there in a year? Anybody know off the top of their head?
525,000.
So if you Googled that real quick, but it's 31.5 million seconds in a year. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children last year received 32 million cyber tip reports for containing child sexual exploitation. 32. That's a cyber tip a second. Let that sink in for a second, for a moment, right? A cyber tip a second. So we're getting bombarded. So obviously, funding. You could double the size of the New York State Police Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, and we would still be busy. Okay, I'm sure Felix can speak to that as well. We are getting inundated. We need assistance in that area. So bodies would be part of it. If I had more time, I would reflect on that. Oh, I got 40 seconds?
Mm-hmm.
That's oh yeah, gotcha.
So now we're down to one recommendation for policy, okay?
One there's a lot of, for me or?
Everybody.
Oh, I'll stop talking.
But you will be able to connect at lunch after this, right? There will be a networking lunch, okay? All right.
I know I gave my policy stuff in the plenary, but I want to say one very specific technical solution is age estimation, is that right now, any device you pick up, the App Store, it is agnostic to the age of the child user. Unless you set up an account that's like, you know, okay, this is the Netflix account that my kid is watching, and then they'll filter in more of the kid content. So right now, we kind of can't enforce or enact child-centered design where there's data privacy protections, there's not all these, you know, content concerns, there's not as much digital nudges or manipulative design, if you don't know who a child user is, or if you make it really easy for kids to fabricate their age when they're logging in. So I think it would also make it easier for the random people who are playing Roblox with our kids and are posing as young children. It would make it easier for app stores to know, I'm not going to let this user download this violent game. There's so many ways that multiple levels of the device, the browsers, the platforms, the app stores would empower them to be able to shift their design to be more protective of safety in terms of contacts from other people and strangers. It would be more protective of mental well-being in terms of saying, all right, by default, we're going to have all these kind of time-prolonging nudge techniques turned off. Maybe we'll have the likes turned off by default, right? So you'd have many more things that would just allow a child to go in and have more of an autonomy and more positive experiences finding their communities without the other potential harms.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm going to build on Dr. Radowski's just information that she talked about and about what's appropriate for each child. And I'm sure that most people in here don't realize when they sign up for an app and they click through it and get their account going that there are recommendations, there are standards that application, wishes for you to abide by. And some of those have to do with the age of the person using the app. I think it's 13 years old for Facebook. And that's dating myself, Facebook. And I think it's the same for Instagram. And 13 years old for Instagram. I know for a fact that there are 8-year-olds on Instagram. I'll come back to this supervision. It's incumbent on the parent. An 8-year-old cannot sign a contract. Can't do it. An 8-year-old cannot make adult decisions. And an 8-year-old cannot sign up for internet service. They cannot sign up for cell phone service. There has to be an adult caregiver that is involved and is responsible. And maybe we need to look at the design of these applications and tools so that there is an adult caregiver who's authorizing it, because it can't just be, I want, because children can be impulsive. Adults can be impulsive, but children have not developed their brains to make serious decisions at that age.
Thank you.
I'm going to take a slightly complementary perspective here because there are so many stakeholders in this ecosystem, and I feel policy has a role to play that is targeted to each of those stakeholders. The stakeholder I'm talking about are the tech companies, are the corporations behind these social media platforms. I believe policy can take the shape of thinking about how do we make these companies more accountable towards young people. And that can take many shapes and many forms. It could be in the form of thinking about a fundamental change in the design of these platforms that is more child and youth-centered. Or it could be more incremental changes to what these platforms do and how they surface content and information to young people. For instance, thinking about the algorithms that curate content and maybe giving more power to the young people to craft their own algorithms that suit their own mental health and well-being. Or maybe thinking about algorithms that are not monetizing the data of these young people towards increasing engagement on the platforms, increasing likes, comments and so on. Policy can also be in the shape of, how do we bring young people into the conversation and the design of these platforms? What do young people want when they get bullied online? What do they want? What kind of moderation happens around self-harm content? Or importantly, what do we do, or what is the responsibility of these platforms when a young person says they're in crisis on the platform? What kind of stakeholders, resources, and help do we engage? And how do we make young people participants of that conversation? So I think policy can go a long way to making these corporations a part of the solution as well.
Thank you.
Since people have been talking about the tech companies, I'm going to talk about something else. And that's empowering young people, peers, so that they can best interact and intervene with peers. Because we know that young people are asking young people for help. And even though we're not the educational panel, but I do think with regard to where the budget should be, and some monies should be spent on mandating, because there's certainly curricula that are being mandated, but with regard to specifically peer training, peer education. I'm involved in another project that's evaluating peer-to-peer crisis lines. There are only a few in the US. We don't know if they're effective. We don't know even if they're safe for the young person who's trying to be the helper. But it's not ever going to be effective unless young people are trained. And they want to have that training because and I don't mean for them to become a mental health professional. Part of the training might be when and where to ask for support. And to make sure that it's not just about their online interventions, it's to enhance their in-person interventions as well. And I hazard to use the real life versus online, because it's all real life, right, in the integration. And so I would like to see our state, in fact, I'd like to say it beyond New York State, but as someone who's been born and bred in New York State and New York City, which I think you can tell from my accent, that I would like to see mandated training for young people, specifically on how to feel confident and capable, really capable, of intervening with other peers.
Thank you. And I would just want to add to that and highlight it. At Families Together, we actually, OMH funds the credential for youth peer advocates, right? So a credential does exist. However, there's always room for improvement. There's always room for expansion. Yes, it's through mental health, but there aren't enough youth mental health advocates or youth peer advocates in the school setting. There aren't enough in homeless shelters. There aren't enough within immigration, because young people exist at multiple intersectionalities, and we navigate through this world every day. And why should it just be a peer in one aspect of the world? So I love that recommendation. So thank you all so much for this wonderful panel. Give it up for our panelists. You guys did a wonderful job.